The silence was deafening when 6 Navy SEALs dropped to one knee in my parents' backyard, their voices cutting through the afternoon air in perfect unison. "Good afternoon, Commander Hayes." My sister's champagne flute shattered against the patio stones, her face draining of all color as she watched the men she'd been bragging about meeting just moments before, men she claimed were real warriors, not weekend pretenders like you, Maya, show the kind of respect she'd never given me in 32 years of shared existence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like every other family gathering in the Hayes household, with Sophia, my younger sister, holding court in our parents' sprawling California home while I sat quietly in the corner, watching her perform what I'd come to think of as her favorite one-woman show, Why Maya Will Never Measure Up. She was regaling our assembled relatives with tales of her latest promotion to senior marketing director at some tech startup, her voice carrying that particular brand of superiority she'd perfected over the years. Her husband Derek nodded along like a bobblehead, occasionally throwing in supportive comments about her real career and actual achievements. Meanwhile, I sipped my coffee and mentally reviewed the mission parameters I'd be briefing to my team in less than 48 hours. And then the CEO said I was the most innovative thinker he'd ever worked with, Sophia continued, her perfectly manicured hands gesturing dramatically. He's flying me to New York next month for the strategy summit, first class, naturally. Our father beamed with pride, that familiar expression I'd seen directed at her countless times, but never at me. "That's my girl," he said, clapping his hands together, "making real moves in the real world." The phrase hit me like it always did, a small, sharp reminder of where I stood in the family hierarchy. In their eyes, my life was perpetually stuck in some kind of adolescent fantasy phase, a grown woman playing dress-up soldier on weekends while avoiding the responsibilities of actual adulthood. Sophia turned to me then, her smile razor-sharp with false concern. "Speaking of careers, Maya, are you still doing that little military thing on weekends? What do they call it? National Guard?" "Marine Corps Reserve," I corrected quietly, though I knew the distinction meant nothing to her. She waved her hand dismissively. Right, the weekend warrior thing. Such a fun little hobby." Her voice dripped with condescension. "Though I have to ask, when are you going to get serious about your future? I mean, playing soldier is cute and all, but you're 32. Don't you think it's time to grow up?" The words stung not because they were particularly creative, Sophia had been using variations of this attack for years, but because of the way everyone in the room nodded along. Our parents, our aunts and uncles, even some of the family friends who'd known me since childhood. They all seemed to agree that my life was somehow less valid, less real, less important than hers. What they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that their weekend warrior had spent the last 15 years climbing through the ranks of the most elite military units in the world. That their little military thing had taken me through 3 combat deployments, countless classified operations, and eventually to a position where I commanded the respect of men and women who were legends in their own right. But I'd learned long ago that trying to explain this to my family was like trying to describe color to someone who'd been blind since birth. They simply couldn't see it, couldn't understand it, and more importantly, didn't want to understand it. In their world, success was measured in corporate promotions, salary increases, and social media followers. Military service was something other people's children did, preferably other people's children from different social classes. I'd enlisted in the Marines straight out of high school, much to my parents' horror. While Sophia was headed to UC Berkeley with their full financial support and emotional enthusiasm, I was shipping off to Paris Island with nothing but their reluctant resignation and hopes that I'd get this phase out of my system before it was too late to salvage my future. Those first years were brutal in ways that had nothing to do with military training. Every family gathering became an exercise in enduring pitying looks and concerned whispers about my choices. When I made it through recruit training and started excelling in my military occupational specialty, they treated it like a participation trophy. When I was selected for specialized training programs, they changed the subject. When I deployed for the first time, they seemed almost embarrassed to mention it to their friends. The worst part wasn't their indifference, it was their active dismissal of everything I'd worked for. During my second deployment, I'd been awarded a Bronze Star for actions during a complex urban warfare situation that I couldn't discuss with them even if they'd been interested. When I came home and they asked about my trip, I mentioned the commendation in passing. My mother's response was to ask if it came with a pay raise, and when I said no, she sighed and said, "Well, I suppose it's nice that you're keeping busy." Sophia, meanwhile, had parlayed her communications degree into a series of marketing jobs, each one accompanied by elaborate celebrations and family-wide proclamations of her genius. Every promotion was a family holiday. Every successful campaign was proof of her exceptional talent. Every raise was validation that she was living life correctly while I was wasting mine on playing army. The irony was so thick I could taste it. While she was crafting social media campaigns for energy drinks and smartphone apps, I was part of teams conducting operations that most people couldn't even imagine. While she was attending corporate retreats in Napa Valley, I was training with Delta Force operators and Navy SEAL teams, earning their respect through demonstrated competence under the most extreme conditions possible. But military culture values discretion, and the most significant achievements in my career were ones I could never discuss at family dinner. The operations that mattered most were classified. The commendations that meant the most came with security clearances that prevented me from even acknowledging their existence. So while Sophia could post LinkedIn updates about her latest marketing victory, I lived in a world where success was measured in missions completed, lives saved, and threats neutralized, none of which could be shared, discussed, or celebrated in civilian company. The reserve component of my service was just the visible tip of an iceberg that extended far deeper than my family could have imagined. What they saw as weekend warrior duty was actually my cover for maintaining my active involvement in special operations communities, joint task forces, and interagency cooperation programs that required someone with my specific skill set and security clearance. My supposed day job as a logistics coordinator for a defense contractor was equally misunderstood. They saw it as a boring office position, the kind of uninspiring work that people settled for when they couldn't find anything better. In reality, it was a carefully constructed cover that allowed me to maintain my clearances, stay current on operational requirements, and serve as a liaison between military units and the private sector support they needed for complex missions. But try explaining that to people who thought the height of professional achievement was getting your own parking space and a corner office window with windows. The morning continued with more of the same. Sophia dominated every conversation, turning each topic back to her own accomplishments with the skill of a seasoned narcissist. When our aunt mentioned her son's graduation from law school, Sophia immediately launched into a story about how she'd been courted by law firms who wanted her to head their marketing departments. When someone brought up a recent news story about military veterans, she made sure to mention how several of her colleagues were former military and how she'd learned so much about real leadership from working with them. That last comment particularly galled me. She spoke about military leadership like it was a management philosophy she'd picked up from a business book, completely oblivious to the fact that she was sitting across from someone who'd actually lived it, breathed it, and earned the right to speak about it through years of blood, sweat, and sacrifice that she couldn't begin to comprehend. But I sat there quietly, as I always did. I'd learned that engaging with Sophia's provocations only gave her more ammunition and provided the family with more evidence that I was the difficult one, the sister who couldn't just be happy for Sophia's success and had to make everything about herself. The afternoon took a particularly ugly turn during lunch when Sophia decided to share what she clearly considered a hilarious story about a recent client meeting. She'd been working with a tech company that was developing apps for military training, and she'd had occasion to meet with some actual service members as part of her research. "So I'm sitting in this conference room with these Navy SEAL guys," she said, her eyes bright with the excitement of having brush with what she considered real celebrities. "And they're telling me about their training and operations. Well, the stuff they could talk about anyway. It was incredible. These are real warriors, men who've actually seen combat, who've done the things that matter." She paused to take a sip of wine, clearly building to her punchline. And I couldn't help but think about Maya and her weekend thing. I mean, these guys were talking about real missions, real danger, real consequences. And here's my sister playing dress-up soldier once a month and thinking she's some kind of military hero. The laughter that followed felt like a physical blow, not just from Sophia, but from Derek, from our parents, from relatives who'd known me since I was a child. They were laughing at the comparison between me and real military personnel, completely unaware that the comparison was far more apt than they could have imagined, just not in the way they thought. Sophia wasn't done. She was on a roll now, energized by her audience's response. I actually asked them about the reserves and the National Guard, just to understand what Maya actually does. And they were so diplomatic about it. They didn't want to say anything negative, but you could tell what they really thought. One of them said something like, well, the reserve components serve an important support function, which is basically military speak for, they're not real soldiers. More laughter, more nodding, more agreement that poor Maya was living in a fantasy while Sophia was out there in the real world, meeting real warriors and doing real work. What Sophia didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the SEALs she'd met weren't just random military personnel impressed by her marketing expertise. They were part of the task force I'd worked with extensively over the previous 2 years. The app development project she thought she was consulted on was actually a cover for a much larger initiative involving advanced training simulations for Special Operations Forces, an initiative that I'd helped design and implement. The diplomatic response she'd received about reserve components wasn't military politeness. It was professional discretion from men who knew exactly who I was and what I'd accomplished, but who couldn't discuss classified operations with a civilian contractor who didn't have the appropriate clearances. But I couldn't explain any of that without revealing operational details that could compromise ongoing missions and violate about a dozen different security protocols. So I sat there and absorbed the mockery, adding it to the growing list of humiliations I'd endured for the sake of maintaining my cover and protecting my family from the complicated realities of my actual life. The conversation eventually moved on to other topics, but the damage was done. I could see it in the way people looked at me for the rest of the afternoon, with a mixture of pity and condescension that was somehow worse than outright hostility. They felt sorry for me, the delusional sister who couldn't accept that she wasn't cut out for real military service and had to content herself with weekend fantasy games. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself thinking about the men Sophia had met, wondering which specific unit they were from and whether I'd worked with them directly. The special operations community is smaller than most people realize, and after 15 years of service, I'd built relationships across multiple units and branches. There was a good chance that the Navy SEAL guys she was so excited about having met were people who knew me professionally and respected my contributions to their missions. The irony was almost too perfect. Sophia was using her brief encounter with real warriors to mock my military service, completely unaware that those same warriors considered me one of their own. She was building her credibility by name-dropping men who would have defended my honor if they'd been present to hear her comments. But that realization also sparked an idea. Dangerous, perhaps, but undeniably tempting. What if there was a way to arrange a demonstration? What if I could create a situation where Sophia's two worlds collided, where her new SEAL acquaintances could meet her weekend warrior sister under circumstances that revealed the true nature of my military credentials? The plan began forming in my mind even as I sat there listening to more stories about her corporate successes and marketing triumphs. It would require careful coordination and absolute discretion, but it wasn't impossible. I had contacts, relationships, and enough operational flexibility to make it happen if I was willing to take the risk. The more I thought about it, the more appealing it became. For 15 years, I'd maintained my cover, protected my family from the complexities of my real life, and endured their dismissive attitude toward my service. I'd told myself it didn't matter, that their opinion wasn't important, that I was serving something larger than family approval. But sitting there, listening to Sophia mock my service while bragging about meeting real warriors, I realized that maybe it did matter. Maybe there was value in showing them who I really was, not for my own satisfaction, but because they deserved to know the truth about the daughter and sister they'd so casually dismissed. The afternoon finally ended with the usual round of hugs and promises to get together again soon. Sophia made sure to give me an extra long embrace, whispering in my ear, "I hope you know I only tease you because I love you. I just want you to be happy and successful like I am." Her words were meant to be kind, but they contained the same underlying assumption that had poisoned our relationship for years, that her definition of happiness and success was the only valid one, and that my choices represented some kind of failure to achieve what she'd accomplished. I hugged her back and told her I loved her too, which was true despite everything. But as I drove home that evening, I was already making mental notes about which contacts to call and how to arrange the kind of demonstration that would force my family to confront the reality they'd spent so many years refusing to acknowledge. The plan I was considering was audacious, potentially career-damaging, and definitely against several regulations regarding the operational security of special operations personnel. But it was also exactly the kind of strategic thinking that had earned me the respect of some of the most elite warriors in the American military. Sophia wanted to meet real warriors? She was about to get more than she'd bargained for. Over the next several days, I made a series of carefully placed phone calls to contacts throughout the special operations community. I wasn't asking for anything that would compromise operational security or violate direct orders, but I was definitely pushing the boundaries of what was considered appropriate use of military relationships for personal purposes. The cover story I developed was elegant in its simplicity. I was organizing a small appreciation event for family members who had supported military personnel throughout their careers. It would be an informal gathering where special operations personnel could meet the relatives of their colleagues and help civilian family members better understand the nature of modern military service. It was technically true. My family had supported me, even if that support had been reluctant and conditional. And there was legitimate value in helping civilian families understand what their military relatives actually did for a living. The fact that it would also serve as a dramatic revelation of my own military credentials was just a fortunate side effect. The responses I received to my inquiries were overwhelmingly positive. The special operations community has always placed a high value on family relationships, understanding that military service affects not just the individual warrior, but their entire support network. The idea of helping a fellow operator bridge the gap between their military and civilian lives was something that resonated with men who had struggled with similar challenges throughout their own careers. Within a week, I had confirmations from 6 different special operations personnel, representing Navy SEALs, Army Special Forces, Marine Raiders, and Air Force Special Operations. They were all men I'd worked with directly on various operations over the previous 5 years, and they all knew me well enough to understand both my military credentials and my family situation. The logistics were surprisingly straightforward. My parents' house had a large backyard that would accommodate a small gathering, and the informal nature of the event meant that it could be presented to my family as a casual barbecue rather than some kind of official military function. The invitation I sent to my family was carefully worded to avoid revealing too much while still generating the kind of curiosity that would ensure good attendance. I told them I wanted to introduce them to some colleagues from my work in the defense sector, and that these were men who could help them better understand what modern military service actually entailed. Sophia's response was immediate and enthusiastic. She saw it as an opportunity to reconnect with the real warriors she'd met during her client meeting and to demonstrate her own knowledge of military culture. She even volunteered to help with food preparation and suggested inviting some of her own friends who would be fascinated to meet actual Navy SEALs and Special Forces guys. I agreed to her suggestions, knowing that a larger audience would only amplify the impact of what I had planned. The week leading up to the gathering was a masterclass in operational planning. I coordinated with my military contacts to ensure they understood the parameters of the demonstration without explicitly telling them what I intended to accomplish. I arranged for appropriate civilian clothes that would still allow them to display their military bearing and credentials when the moment was right. Most importantly, I prepared myself mentally for the possibility that this plan could backfire spectacularly and damage both my family relationships and my military career. But as the date approached, I found myself feeling more excited than nervous. For 15 years, I'd lived a compartmentalized life, keeping my two worlds completely separate to protect both my family and my mission. The prospect of finally bringing those worlds together, of showing my family who I really was and what I'd actually accomplished, felt like a liberation I hadn't realized I needed. The day of the gathering dawned clear and warm, perfect weather for an outdoor barbecue. I arrived at my parents' house early to help with preparations, finding Sophia already there and buzzing with excitement about meeting real military heroes. She'd dressed for the occasion in what she clearly considered appropriate attire for meeting warriors: designer jeans, a fitted top that showed just enough skin to be flattering without being inappropriate, and expensive jewelry that signaled her success and sophistication. She looked like she was attending a networking event, which, in her mind, she probably was. "I've been thinking about what you said about your defense work," she told me as we arranged chairs in the backyard. "I realize I might have been a little dismissive about your career. I mean, if you're working with guys like the ones I met, you must be doing something more important than I thought." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever received from her, and it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of my actual role in the defense sector. But I accepted it graciously, knowing that her understanding was about to change dramatically. Our parents were equally excited about the gathering, though their enthusiasm was tinged with the kind of nervous energy that comes from not quite understanding what they'd agreed to host. They'd spent the morning cleaning the house and preparing food, treating it like they were entertaining visiting dignitaries rather than having a casual barbecue with some of their daughter's colleagues. The guests began arriving around 2 in the afternoon. First came Mark, a Navy SEAL chief petty officer I'd worked with on 3 separate operations. He was followed by Carlos, a Green Beret master sergeant who'd been my partner in a particularly complex mission in Afghanistan. Then came Jake, another SEAL who'd served as my liaison during a joint task force operation the previous year. Each arrival followed the same pattern. The men would introduce themselves to my family with their names and civilian occupations, the cover jobs they used when they weren't on active duty or deployment. They were polite, professional, and engaging, exactly the kind of men who would impress my family and validate Sophia's excitement about meeting real warriors. But they also positioned themselves in ways that allowed them to maintain visual contact with me, following protocols we'd developed during our operational experience. They were treating this like a mission, with me as the primary they were there to support. Sophia was in her element, charming the visitors with her wit and intelligence while subtly establishing her own credentials through references to her client work with military applications. She mentioned her recent meeting with some Navy SEALs and was thrilled when Mark and Jake confirmed that they probably knew the men she'd met. "It's such a small community," she said, clearly pleased with herself for having made the connection. "I was just telling Maya how impressed I was with their professionalism and expertise. Real warriors, not like the weekend warrior thing my sister does." The comment hung in the air for a moment, and I saw Mark and Jake exchange a glance. They knew exactly who Maya was and what she'd accomplished, but they were following my lead regarding when and how to reveal that information. The afternoon continued with more conversation, more storytelling, and more evidence of Sophia's fundamental misunderstanding of my role in the defense community. She spoke about me like I was a peripheral figure in a world where she was becoming increasingly connected and influential. Our parents beamed with pride as Sophia held court, clearly believing that their successful daughter was once again demonstrating her superior ability to navigate complex social and professional situations. Meanwhile, I sat quietly, playing the role of the supporting sister who was grateful to have Sophia help her connect with important people in her field. The turning point came when Derek, Sophia's husband, asked the visitors about their experiences with Reserve and National Guard personnel. It was an innocent question, probably motivated by genuine curiosity about my military service, but it opened the door for exactly the kind of demonstration I'd been waiting for. Mark answered first, his response carefully calibrated to build toward the revelation I had planned. "The reserve components do incredibly important work," he said. "Some of our most effective operations have involved reserve personnel who bring specialized skills and experience that complement our active duty capabilities." Carlos nodded in agreement. "In fact, some of the best officers and operators I've worked with have been reserve personnel. They bring a different perspective, often more strategic thinking, because they're not caught up in the day-to-day military bureaucracy." Sophia smiled graciously, clearly interpreting these comments as diplomatic praise for weekend warriors like her sister. "That's so generous of you to say. I know Maya really values her reserve service, even though it's obviously not the same as what you guys do." Another exchanged glance between my visitors. Jake leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. Actually, that brings up an interesting point. The distinction between reserve and active duty isn't always as clear as people think. Some of the most accomplished operators I know technically serve in reserve status, but are actually more active than most regular military personnel. Really? Sophia asked, her tone suggesting polite skepticism. I didn't realize that was possible. Oh, absolutely, Mark chimed in. In fact, I've worked with reserve officers who commanded joint operations involving multiple special operations units. Their military credentials and operational experience were every bit as extensive as any active duty commander I've served under. Really? Sophia asked, her tone suggesting polite skepticism. I didn't realize that was possible. Oh, absolutely, Mark chimed in. In fact, I've worked with reserve officers who commanded joint operations involving multiple special operations units. Their military credentials and operational experience were every bit as extensive as any active duty commander I've served under. The conversation was heading exactly where I'd hoped it would, building toward a revelation that would reframe everything my family thought they knew about my military service. But before I could signal my visitors to proceed to the next phase of the demonstration, Sophia inadvertently accelerated the timeline with a comment that was both more insulting and more perfectly timed than anything I could have orchestrated. She laughed lightly, the sound containing just enough condescension to be unmistakable. Well, that's certainly not the case with Maya. I mean, she's been doing her weekend warrior thing for years, and she's still just a basic soldier. No offense, she added, glancing at me with false concern, but you've never been promoted or given any kind of leadership role, right? I think you'd have mentioned it if you were actually commanding other soldiers. The silence that followed her comment was profound. Every one of my visitors went completely still, their expressions shifting from polite social engagement to something much more serious. The casual afternoon barbecue atmosphere evaporated in an instant, replaced by the kind of tension that precedes significant military action. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of 15 years of hidden service and accumulated frustration. This was the moment I'd been building toward, the opportunity to show my family who I really was and what I'd actually accomplished while they were dismissing my life as an extended adolescent fantasy. Actually, Sophia, I said, my voice carrying authority I'd never used in family settings, there are a few things about my military service that we should probably discuss. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. Mark, Carlos, and Jake rose to their feet in perfect synchronization, their casual demeanor replaced by military bearing so sharp it seemed to cut through the afternoon air. The other 3 operators who had been scattered around the patio moved with fluid precision to form a loose formation, their positions calculated to provide both security and maximum visual impact. Ma'am, Mark said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of a man accustomed to briefing senior officers, permission to demonstrate proper military protocol for your family? I nodded once, feeling the familiar surge of command presence that I'd carefully suppressed for so many years in civilian settings. Proceed, Chief. What happened next would be burned into my family's memory forever. 6 of the most elite warriors in the American military moved with choreographed precision, dropping to one knee in a perfect line across my parents' manicured lawn. Their voices rang out in unison, cutting through the suburban silence like a ceremonial sword. Good afternoon, Commander Hayes. The sound of Sophia's champagne flute hitting the patio stones was like a gunshot in the sudden stillness. The crystal exploded into 1,000 glittering fragments, mirroring the shattering of every assumption my family had held about my life for the past 15 years. My father's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror as he processed what he was witnessing. My mother's hand flew to her throat, her eyes wide with shock as she stared at her weekend warrior daughter receiving the kind of respect she'd only seen in movies. But it was Sophia's reaction that validated every difficult decision I'd made in orchestrating this revelation. Her face went through a rapid succession of emotions: confusion, denial, anger, and finally a kind of sick realization that everything she thought she knew about her sister's life had been fundamentally wrong. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own ragged breathing. Maya's just a reserve soldier. She works in logistics. She's never even been promoted past sergeant. Jake, still kneeling with the others, spoke without breaking his position of respect. Ma'am, with your permission, I believe there may be some confusion about the commander's service record and current rank. I looked down at the 6 men who had chosen to demonstrate their respect for me in the most public and unmistakable way possible. These were warriors who had faced enemy fire, completed impossible missions, and earned the right to call themselves the best of the best. And they were kneeling in my honor, not because I'd asked them to, but because they believed I'd earned that respect through years of shared service and mutual sacrifice. "Stand down, gentlemen," I said, using the command voice that had directed operations across 3 combat theaters. "Thank you for the demonstration." They rose as one, maintaining their formation but relaxing slightly into a more conversational posture. The military precision remained, but the formal ceremony was complete. Now came the part I'd been both anticipating and dreading, the explanation that would force my family to confront 15 years of willful ignorance out who I really was. Sophia found her voice first, though it came out as more of a croak than her usual confident projection. "Commander? Maya, what is he talking about? You're not a commander."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"You're barely even a real soldier." The casual dismissal, delivered even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, was so perfectly characteristic of Sophia that I almost laughed. Even confronted with 6 Navy SEALs and Special Forces operators addressing me by a rank she didn't think I possessed, she was still committed to her narrative about my inadequate military service. "Actually," Carlos said, his tone respectful but firm, "Lieutenant Colonel Hayes has been one of the most effective special operations commanders I've had the privilege to serve under. Her tactical planning and operational leadership have been instrumental in some of our most successful missions over the past 5 years." The title hit my family like a physical blow. Lieutenant Colonel. Not sergeant, not even captain, but a field-grade officer rank that typically required 15 to 20 years of exemplary service and demonstrated leadership ability. It was a rank that commanded respect from every branch of the military and carried authority that most civilian employers would find difficult to comprehend. My mother sank into one of the patio chairs, her face pale as she processed the implications of what she was hearing. "Lieutenant Colonel?" she repeated weakly. "But Maya never said, we never knew." "The nature of the commander's work requires operational security protocols that limit what can be discussed with civilian family members," Mark explained, his tone gentle but educational. "Many of her achievements and deployments are classified at levels that prevent public acknowledgement." Derek, who had been silent throughout the demonstration, finally found his voice. "Wait, deployments? Maya told us she'd never been deployed. She said her reserve duty was all stateside training exercises." The men exchanged glances that spoke volumes about operational security and the kinds of missions that officially never happened. Jake stepped forward, clearly choosing his words carefully to avoid revealing classified information while still providing enough context to help my family understand the scope of my actual service. "Sir, with respect, special operations deployments often occur under cover stories that protect both the operators and their families from potential security threats. The commander's family believing she was engaged in routine training exercises was actually a sophisticated cover that allowed her to maintain her civilian relationships while conducting some of the most sensitive missions in the current operational environment." Sophia's legs seemed to give out, and she collapsed into a chair beside our mother. Her face had gone through several color changes, finally settling on a sickly greenish pallor that matched her growing realization of how thoroughly she'd misunderstood her sister's life. "But the logistics job," she said weakly. "Maya works for a defense contractor doing boring office work. She's told us about her cubicle and her spreadsheets and her meaningless reports." Carlos smiled grimly. "Ma'am, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes' civilian position is as a senior strategic analyst for one of the premier defense consulting firms in the country. Her spreadsheets and reports inform Pentagon decision-making on some of the most critical national security issues we face. The boring office work she's described is actually intelligence analysis that directly supports special operations planning worldwide." Each revelation was like another hammer blow against the foundation of assumptions my family had built about my life. I could see them struggling to reconcile the daughter and sister they thought they knew with the woman being described by these obviously elite military personnel. My father, who had spent years patronizing me about my lack of real-world experience, looked like he was having trouble breathing. The man who had dismissed my military service as a hobby was being forced to confront the reality that his daughter outranked most of the military personnel he'd ever met and commanded the respect of warriors whose achievements he could barely comprehend. "I need to understand something," Sophia said, her voice growing stronger as anger began to replace shock. "If Maya is really this important military commander, why didn't she ever tell us? Why did she let us think she was just a weekend warrior playing soldier?" It was the question I'd been expecting, and the one that would require the most careful answer. The truth was complicated, involving operational security, family dynamics, and 15 years of accumulated hurt that had crystallized into a protective wall between my two lives. The initial operational security requirements were legitimate, I began, my voice steady despite the emotional undertow of what I was revealing. When I first started working with special operations units, the nature of the missions required that my family believe I was engaged in routine reserve activities. That cover story protected both the operations and all of you from potential security threats. I paused, looking at each of their faces as they processed this information. But over time, as my rank and responsibilities increased, the security requirements became less stringent. I could have told you more about my actual service, my deployments, my achievements. I chose not to. The admission hung in the air like a challenge. Sophia leaned forward, her expression hardening into something that looked more familiar, the aggressive stance she took whenever she felt threatened or criticized. "You chose not to?" she repeated. "You chose to let us think you were a failure? You chose to sit there while we worried about your future and your lack of direction? What kind of person does that?" The question contained all the self-righteousness and victimization that had characterized Sophia's responses to being challenged throughout our lives. Even confronted with evidence of her own years of condescending dismissal, she was managing to frame my secrecy as a betrayal of her rather than a response to her treatment. The kind of person who got tired of being dismissed, minimized, and patronized every time she tried to share anything meaningful about her life, I replied, my voice carrying the accumulated weight of 15 years of family gatherings like this one. The truth was more complicated than that simple explanation, but it was a truth that needed to be said. My family's inability to see me, to value what I was doing, to understand that my life had meaning and purpose beyond their narrow definitions of success, that had been the real reason for my secrecy.
Mark, apparently sensing that the family dynamic was moving into territory that required careful navigation, stepped forward with the kind of diplomatic intervention that special operations personnel learn to employ in complex political situations. "If I may," he said, addressing my parents rather than Sophia, the commander's decision to maintain operational security with her family was consistent with protocols we recommend for all special operations personnel. The nature of our work creates situations where family members can become targets if too much information is shared about our activities and achievements. He gestured toward his fellow operators. We've all maintained similar cover stories with our own families. The difference is that most of our relatives understand and respect the need for secrecy, even when they don't understand the details of what we do. The implication was clear, though diplomatically stated. My family's failure to respect my service, even in its supposedly limited form, had contributed to my decision to maintain the cover story long after it was operationally necessary. Carlos added his own perspective, his tone gentle but pointed. In our experience, family support is crucial for operators dealing with the stress of special operations service. When that support isn't available, or when family members actively dismiss the importance of military service, it creates additional psychological pressure that can affect operational performance. Again, the message was clear without being directly accusatory. My family's attitude toward my military service hadn't just hurt my feelings, it had potentially compromised my ability to perform missions that affected national security. My mother, who had been listening to this exchange with growing distress, finally spoke up. "We didn't know," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Maya, we didn't know what you were really doing. If you had told us—" "I tried," I interrupted, the words coming out sharper than I'd intended. "For years, I tried to share what I could about my service. Every time I mentioned an achievement, a promotion, a deployment, you changed the subject or dismissed it as unimportant. You made it clear that my military service was an embarrassment to you, something you tolerated but didn't want to hear about. The accusations sparked defensive reactions from both parents. My father straightened in his chair, his face reddening with the indignation of someone who didn't like having his parenting questioned. "That's not fair, Maya," he said. "We've always supported your choices, even when we didn't understand them. We never said your military service was unimportant." Jake, who had been observing this family dynamic with the analytical eye of someone trained in human behavior assessment, made a strategic intervention that cut through the defensive deflection. "Sir, with respect, may I ask what you understood about your daughter's military service prior to today's demonstration?" My father blinked, clearly caught off guard by the direct question. "Well, she's in the Marine Corps Reserve. She goes to drill weekends once a month and annual training for 2 weeks each summer. She's never been deployed, never been in combat, never really advanced beyond basic enlisted rank." Every single statement was wrong, and Jake let the errors hang in the air for a moment before responding with professional precision. "Sir, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes has completed 7 combat deployments across 3 different theaters of operation. She's been awarded the Bronze Star with Valor, the Purple Heart, and the Defense Superior Service Medal, among other commendations. She commands a joint special operations task force that includes personnel from all 4 branches of the military plus international partners. Her current assignment involves strategic planning for some of the most sensitive national security operations currently being conducted." The litany of achievements hit my family like artillery rounds, each fact demolishing another piece of their constructed narrative about my inadequate military career. But Jake wasn't finished. "The training exercises you mentioned are actually cover stories for classified operations that I cannot discuss in detail. The drill weekends often involve briefings and planning sessions for missions that directly impact American national security. The annual training typically consists of advanced combat training with special operations units from allied nations." He paused, letting the information sink in before delivering the final blow. "In short, sir, every assumption you've made about your daughter's military service has been incorrect. She's not a weekend warrior playing soldier. She's one of the most accomplished special operations commanders currently serving in the United States military." The silence that followed was deafening. My parents sat stunned, processing the reality that they had fundamentally misunderstood their daughter's life for 15 years. But it was Sophia's reaction that captured my attention. Instead of shock or remorse, her face was beginning to show signs of a different emotion, entirely. "This is insane," she said, her voice rising with familiar indignation. "You're telling me that Maya has been lying to us for 15 years? That she's been some kind of secret super soldier while letting us think she was a loser who couldn't get her life together?" The characterization was so perfectly Sophia that I almost admired its consistency. Even confronted with overwhelming evidence of my achievements, she was managing to frame the revelation as something I had done wrong, a betrayal of her rather than a response to years of her dismissive treatment. "Ma'am," Mark said, his voice carrying a firm edge that suggested his patience with her attitude was wearing thin. "With respect, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes hasn't been lying to you. She's been protecting classified information while maintaining necessary operational security. The fact that you interpreted her discretion says more about your assumptions than about her service record." The rebuke was delivered with military precision, respectful but unmistakably critical. Sophia wasn't accustomed to being challenged by people she couldn't dismiss or intimidate, and the experience of being corrected by a Navy SEAL was clearly unsettling for her. But rather than backing down, she doubled down on her victimization narrative. "So now I'm the bad guy? I'm the one who's been wrong for caring about my sister's future, for wanting her to have a real career and a real life?" Carlos stepped forward, his expression serious. "Ma'am, your sister has a real career."
She has one of the most important and demanding careers possible. The fact that you don't consider military service to be a real career is part of the problem she's been dealing with. The direct confrontation seemed to shock Sophia into momentary silence. She wasn't used to having her fundamental assumptions about life and success challenged by people whose credentials she couldn't question. These weren't family members she could dismiss or civilians she could condescend to. These were genuine American heroes, telling her that her worldview was fundamentally flawed. But Sophia had never been one to surrender an argument easily, and she quickly regrouped for another attack. "Fine," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "So Maya's a big, important commander. That still doesn't excuse the lying. It doesn't excuse letting us worry about her for years. It doesn't excuse sitting there like a victim while we tried to help her figure out her life." The accusation contained enough truth to sting, but it also revealed the fundamental narcissism that had driven our family dynamic for decades. In Sophia's mind, my operational security hadn't been about protecting national security or following military protocols. It had been about making her look foolish and causing her emotional distress. "Sophia," I said, my voice carrying the command authority I'd never used with family before, "you weren't trying to help me figure out my life. You were trying to make yourself feel superior by pointing out what you saw as my failures. There's a difference." The direct confrontation seemed to energize her, bringing out the argumentative streak that had made family gatherings miserable for years. "That's not true," she snapped. "I was concerned about you. We all were. You seemed lost, directionless, stuck in some kind of extended adolescence where you were playing soldier instead of building a real career." Jake made another strategic intervention, his tone professional but pointed. "Ma'am, may I ask what qualifications you have to assess the value or importance of military service?" The question caught Sophia off guard. She blinked several times, clearly trying to formulate a response that wouldn't make her sound completely ignorant about the subject she'd been dismissing for years. "I don't need military qualifications to recognize success," she said finally. "I know what real achievement looks like. I know what it means to build a career, to get promoted, to make a difference in the world." Mark's response was delivered with the kind of precision that comes from years of briefing senior officers who don't like to have their time wasted. "Ma'am, your sister commands a budget larger than the annual revenue of most Fortune 500 companies. She's responsible for personnel whose decisions affect the safety of American citizens worldwide. Her strategic planning has contributed to operations that have prevented terrorist attacks, disrupted international criminal organizations, and protected American interests in some of the most dangerous regions on Earth." He paused, letting the scope of my responsibilities sink in before continuing. "With respect, marketing energy drinks to college students doesn't provide the experience necessary to evaluate that kind of responsibility or achievement." The comment was brutal in its accuracy, stripping away the pretense that had allowed Sophia to position herself as the successful sister who could offer guidance to her underachieving sibling. Suddenly, her corporate achievements seemed small and provincial compared to the global responsibilities these men were describing. But rather than acknowledging the point, Sophia fell back on personal attack, her usual strategy when logical argument failed her. "So now you're going to insult my career? You're going to act like marketing isn't important, like business success doesn't matter?" Carlos sighed, his expression suggesting that he dealt with this kind of civilian arrogance before. "Ma'am, no one is insulting your career. We're simply pointing out that your professional experience doesn't qualify you to judge the value or importance of military service, particularly special operations service." He gestured toward me with obvious respect. "Lieutenant Colonel Hayes has spent 15 years developing expertise in areas that most people can't even comprehend. She's earned the right to be taken seriously by people who understand what she does. The fact that her own family doesn't understand or respect her service is unfortunate." The diplomatic phrasing couldn't hide the underlying criticism. These men were making it clear that they viewed my family's treatment of my service as a form of ignorance that reflected poorly on us as people, not just as relatives. My parents, who had been silent during this exchange, finally began to grasp the magnitude of what they'd missed. My mother's face was etched with what looked like genuine remorse, while my father appeared to be struggling with the cognitive dissonance of learning that his unsuccessful daughter actually outranked him in every meaningful measure of professional achievement. "Maya," my mother said softly, "I'm so sorry. We didn't understand. If we had known—" "You could have known,"
I tried to tell you. Every time I mentioned a promotion, a deployment, an achievement, you dismissed it or changed the subject. You made it clear that my military service was something you tolerated, not something you wanted to hear about. The accusation hung in the air, and I could see my parents struggling with the memory of countless conversations where they'd done exactly what I was describing. The uncomfortable truth was that they had actively chosen not to know about my military service because it didn't fit their vision of what their daughter's life should look like.
Jake's response was measured but pointed. Sir, with respect, why did you assume that military service and happiness were incompatible? Why did you assume that Lieutenant Colonel Hayes couldn't be successful in the career she'd chosen? The question cut to the heart of the bias that had poisoned my family relationships for years. They had never taken my military service seriously because they had never taken the military seriously as a career path for people like us, educated, middle-class professionals who were supposed to aspire to corporate success and suburban respectability. It's not that we don't respect the military, my mother said quickly. It's just that we wanted Maya to have the kind of life where she could settle down, have a family, build something stable and secure. Mark's laugh was short and humorless. Ma'am, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes has one of the most secure and stable careers possible. She has job security that most civilian professionals would kill for, retirement benefits that are guaranteed by the federal government, and healthcare coverage that extends to her entire family. She also has the respect and admiration of some of the most accomplished people in the country. He gestured toward his fellow operators. The men in this backyard represent the kind of professional network that most business executives spend their entire careers trying to build. We've served together, fought together, and earned each other's trust through shared sacrifice that goes far beyond anything most civilian colleagues experience. The comparison to civilian professional networks was particularly effective because it translated military relationships into terms my family could understand. They were beginning to grasp that my military service hadn't isolated me from professional success. It had connected me to a community of elite performers whose achievements dwarfed anything they'd encountered in their civilian careers. Sophia, however, was still struggling to accept the fundamental revision of reality that was being forced upon her. "This is all very impressive," she said, her tone suggesting that she found it anything but impressive. "But it still doesn't explain why Maya felt the need to deceive us for so many years." The persistence of her victimization narrative was remarkable. Even confronted with 6 special operations personnel explaining the operational necessity and family dynamics that had driven my secrecy, she was still focused on how my choices had wronged her, rather than examining her own role in creating the situation. "Ma'am," Carlos said, his voice carrying a note of exasperation that suggested his diplomatic patience was reaching its limits, "your sister didn't deceive you. She protected classified information while following operational security protocols. The fact that you interpreted her discretion as deception reveals more about your attitude toward her service than about her integrity." The rebuke was sharp enough to finally penetrate Sophia's defensive indignation. For the first time since the demonstration began, she seemed to realize that her position was becoming untenable. 6 of America's most elite warriors were essentially telling her that she'd been wrong about everything, and her continued insistence on being the victim was making her look foolish. But rather than backing down gracefully, she made one final attempt to salvage her narrative. "Fine," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Maybe I was wrong about Maya's military service, but that doesn't change the fact that she spent years lying to our faces and making us look like fools." The accusation was delivered with enough venom to make it clear that Sophia's primary concern wasn't understanding my service or repairing our relationship. It was protecting her own ego from the humiliation of being proven wrong so thoroughly and so publicly. I looked at my sister, this woman who had spent decades positioning herself as the successful one, the achiever, the daughter who had figured out how to navigate the real world, and I realized that nothing I could say or do would make her understand what she'd missed or acknowledge her role in our damaged relationship. "Sophia," I said, my voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who no longer needed her approval or validation, I'm not responsible for how you look or how you feel about being wrong. I'm responsible for completing my missions, protecting my team, and serving my country. Your opinion of my choices stopped mattering to me a long time ago." The dismissal was absolute and final, delivered with the kind of professional distance I used when dealing with security threats that required neutralization rather than negotiation. For the first time in our adult lives, I was treating Sophia like what she'd always been, a hostile element that needed to be managed rather than appeased. The effect was immediate and devastating. Sophia's face cycled through several expressions before settling on something that looked like genuine shock. She'd never encountered this version of her sister before, confident, authoritative, and completely indifferent to her disapproval. The demonstration was complete. My family had seen who I really was, what I'd actually accomplished, and how I was regarded by people whose opinions mattered in ways theirs never could. The revelations had shattered their comfortable assumptions and forced them to confront 15 years of willful ignorance about my life and service. But as I looked at their faces, shocked, remorseful, angry, confused, I realized that the satisfaction I'd expected to feel was overshadowed by a deeper sense of sadness. These were people who should have known me, should have supported me, should have taken the time to understand what I was doing with my life. Instead, they had chosen comfort over truth, assumptions over inquiry, and their own narrow definitions of success over any genuine interest in my achievements. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the patio where my two worlds had finally collided. The demonstration was over, the truth was revealed, and there was no going back to the old dynamic where I played the role of the unsuccessful sister who needed their guidance and pity. Mark stepped forward, apparently sensing that the emotional revelations had reached their natural conclusion. "Commander, if there's nothing else you need from us today, we should probably begin our withdrawal." The military terminology was deliberate, framing their departure as the end of a successful operation rather than the awkward conclusion of a family gathering. It was a professional courtesy that acknowledged the significance of what had just occurred while providing a graceful exit strategy. "Thank you, Chief," I replied, matching his formal tone. "The mission was accomplished exactly as briefed. Please extend my gratitude to the team for their professionalism and discretion." The exchange was conducted entirely in military language, emphasizing the professional relationship that existed between us while subtly excluding my family from the conversation. It was a final demonstration of the respect and camaraderie that defined my real life, contrasted with the dismissive treatment I'd received from the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. As the 6 operators prepared to leave, each one took a moment to shake my hand and offer words of respect and support. Their gestures were formal but genuine, the kind of recognition that military personnel reserve for colleagues who have earned their trust through demonstrated competence and shared sacrifice. "It's been an honor serving with you, Commander," Jake said as he prepared to leave, "and it's an educational meeting your family." The comment was diplomatically phrased, but the underlying message was clear. These men had witnessed the family dynamic that I'd been dealing with for years, and they understood why I'd chosen to keep my 2 lives separate. Their respect for me had increased rather than decreased as a result of seeing how I'd navigated the complex challenge of maintaining operational security while managing family relationships that didn't support or understand my service.
After the operators left, my family and I were alone in the backyard for the first time since the demonstration began. The silence was profound, filled with the weight of revelations that couldn't be taken back or forgotten. Everything had changed, and we all knew it. My parents sat quietly, their faces reflecting the complex emotions that come with learning you fundamentally misunderstood someone you thought you knew completely. The pride they'd always reserved for Sophia was now tempered by the realization that their other daughter had been achieving things they could barely comprehend while they'd been dismissing her as a failure. Sophia remained in her chair, staring at the spot where the 6 operators had knelt in my honor. Her face was a mask of conflicting emotions: anger, embarrassment, confusion, and something that might have been the first glimmer of genuine understanding about who her sister really was. The afternoon that had begun with familiar patterns of family dismissal and condescension had ended with a complete reversal of power dynamics that would reshape our relationships forever. There was no going back to the old assumptions, no pretending that the revelations hadn't occurred. no returning to the comfortable fiction that had allowed them to dismiss my life as unsuccessful and directionless. I had finally shown them who I was, what I'd accomplished, and how I was regarded by people whose respect actually mattered. The question now was what they would do with that knowledge, and whether our family relationships could survive the shattering of so many years of willful ignorance and accumulated resentment. The sun continued to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded me of combat zones I couldn't discuss and operations I couldn't acknowledge. It was beautiful and peaceful, a perfect California evening that bore no resemblance to the places where I'd earned the respect of the men who had just honored me in front of my family. But for the first time in 15 years, I felt like I could finally be myself in both worlds, the accomplished military commander and the daughter who had never quite measured up to her family's expectations. The walls between my two lives had been demolished, and whatever came next would have to be built on the foundation of truth rather than comfortable lies. The weeks that followed the demonstration brought changes that rippled through every aspect of my family relationships like aftershocks from a seismic event. The comfortable patterns that had governed our interactions for decades were completely disrupted, leaving everyone struggling to find new equilibrium in a reality where their assumptions about Maya Hayes had been permanently shattered. My mother was the first to reach out, calling 3 days after the barbecue with a voice heavy with emotion and uncertainty. The conversation was awkward and halting, filled with long pauses as she struggled to find words for feelings she'd never had to articulate before. "Maya, I keep thinking about what those men said about your deployments," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "When you told us you were going to those training exercises, you were actually going to war zones, weren't you?" The question hung between us, loaded with years of missed opportunities for honesty and connection. I could hear her crying softly on the other end of the line, and for a moment I felt the old familiar urge to comfort her, to minimize my experiences, to make her feel better about not knowing. But that version of myself was gone, replaced by someone who had learned to value truth over family comfort. "Yes, Mom," I said simply. 7 combat deployments over 12 years. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and places I still can't name. Each time you thought I was at some training base in North Carolina or California, I was actually leading missions in active combat zones. The silence that followed was profound. I could almost hear her processing the implications, imagining her daughter in situations she'd only seen in movies, facing dangers she'd never had to consider while she was worried about my lack of career advancement and relationship prospects. "Were you ever hurt?" she asked, finally, her voice breaking on the words. I thought about the Purple Heart that Jake had mentioned, earned during a firefight outside Kandahar when shrapnel from an IED had torn through my left shoulder and upper arm. I thought about the concussion from a mortar attack in Ramadi, the burns from an explosive device in Damascus, the dozens of close calls that had left me physically intact but emotionally marked in ways that would never fully heal. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But I had good medical care and better team members. I always came home." What I didn't tell her was about the nights I'd lain awake in field hospitals, wondering if anyone back home would even notice if I didn't make it back. I didn't tell her about writing letters I hoped would never be sent, or about the hollow feeling of knowing that my most significant achievements would never be acknowledged by the people whose approval I'd once craved. "I don't understand why you couldn't tell us," she said, and I could hear the familiar note of hurt victimization that had characterized so many of our conversations over the years. "Because every time I tried to share anything meaningful about my military service, you changed the subject or found ways to minimize it," I replied, my voice steady but firm. "Because you made it clear that my choices disappointed you and that you'd rather not hear about them." The accusation sparked a defensive response that was entirely predictable. "That's not true, Maya. We've always supported your choices, even when we didn't understand them." "Support and understanding are different things, Mom," I said. "You tolerated my military service because you had to, but you never tried to understand it or value it. There's a difference between accepting someone's choices and actually caring about what those choices mean to them." The conversation continued for another hour, covering familiar ground with new context. My mother alternated between expressions of remorse and attempts to justify their previous attitudes, struggling to reconcile her image of herself as a supportive parent with the reality that she'd fundamentally misunderstood her daughter's life for 15 years. By the end of the call, we'd reached a tentative detente that felt more honest than any conversation we'd had in years. She promised to try to understand my military service better, and I promised to be more open about the aspects of my life that I could share. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a beginning. My father's response was more complex and took longer to develop. He'd built his identity around being the successful patriarch who could offer guidance and wisdom to his children based on his own professional achievements. Learning that his daughter had surpassed him in every meaningful measure of responsibility, authority, and accomplishment was a blow to his ego that took weeks to process. When he finally called, nearly a month after the demonstration, his tone was formal and stiff, like he was conducting a business meeting with someone he didn't quite trust. "I've been doing some research about military ranks and responsibilities," he said, without preamble. "I wanted to understand what lieutenant colonel actually means in terms of career progression and authority." I waited, sensing that he had more to say and that interrupting would derail whatever conversation he was trying to have. "According to what I've read, lieutenant colonel is equivalent to a senior executive position in civilian terms, someone who commands thousands of personnel and manages budgets in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Is that accurate?" "In special operations, the personnel numbers are smaller, but the responsibilities are often greater," I replied carefully. "I'm responsible for highly specialized teams conducting missions that have strategic rather than just tactical importance."
The budget authority varies depending on the operation, but yes, it's substantial. He was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically hear him recalculating his understanding of my professional status. For a man who had spent his career climbing the corporate ladder and measuring success in terms of title progression and salary increases, the realization that his daughter held a position of genuine authority and responsibility was requiring a fundamental reassessment of our relationship dynamic. "Why didn't you ever tell me about your promotions?" he asked finally. "I tell you about every advancement in my career. I thought we shared that kind of information." The question revealed the depth of his misunderstanding about military culture and operational security, but it also showed a genuine desire to understand why our relationship had developed the way it had. "Dad, I tried to tell you about my promotions for years," I said gently. "Every time I made rank, I'd mention it to you and Mom, but you always responded like it was a participation trophy rather than a real achievement. After a while, I stopped trying to share that kind of news because it was clear you didn't see it as important." The accusation hit home in a way that surprised both of us. I heard him intake sharply, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, more vulnerable and uncertain than I'd ever heard it. "I didn't realize," he said quietly. "I thought military promotions were automatic, based on time and service rather than merit. I didn't understand that you were competing with other qualified personnel for advancement opportunities." It was a small admission, but it represented a significant shift in his understanding of military service and my achievements within that system. We talked for another hour about promotion timelines, selection processes, and the kind of performance evaluations that had led to my advancement through the ranks. By the end of the conversation, he was asking detailed questions about my responsibilities and expressing what sounded like genuine pride in my achievements. It wasn't the same as the enthusiastic support he'd always shown for Sophia's corporate success, but it was recognition and respect based on actual understanding rather than familial obligation. Sophia's response was the most complicated and took the longest to develop into anything resembling a functional relationship. For weeks after the demonstration, she avoided all contact with me and, according to our parents, was telling anyone who would listen that I'd deceived the family for years and had set her up for public humiliation. Her narrative framed the entire revelation as something I'd done to her, rather than a response to years of her dismissive treatment. In Sophia's version of events, she was the victim of my elaborate deception, rather than someone who had consistently refused to acknowledge or respect my military service. The first direct contact came in the form of a long, rambling email that arrived 6 weeks after the barbecue. It was classic Sophia, a mixture of self-justification, selective memory, and attempts to reframe the situation in ways that protected her ego while acknowledging the minimum amount of personal responsibility necessary to maintain plausible deniability about her role in our damaged relationship. The email began with what sounded like an apology, but quickly devolved into a list of reasons why her behavior had been understandable and justified. She claimed that my secrecy had forced her to make assumptions about my military service, and that if I had been more open about my achievements, she would have been more supportive. It was a masterpiece of deflection that managed to acknowledge the facts while avoiding any real accountability for her attitude or actions. Reading it, I was struck by how thoroughly she'd missed the point of what had been revealed at the barbecue. This wasn't just about military rank or operational security. It was about fundamental respect for someone's choices and achievements, regardless of whether those achievements fit into your preferred categories of success. I didn't respond to the email immediately. Instead, I spent several days thinking about what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted to have with Sophia going forward. The demonstration had been about showing my family who I really was, but it had also been about establishing boundaries and demanding the kind of respect that I'd been denied for too many years. When I finally replied, my response was brief and direct. I acknowledged her email, but made it clear that any future relationship between us would need to be based on mutual respect and genuine understanding, rather than the old dynamic where she positioned herself as the successful sister offering guidance to her underachieving sibling. I told her that I was willing to rebuild our relationship on an equal footing, but that I wasn't interested in returning to the previous pattern where my life and choices were subject to her judgment and criticism. If she wanted to be part of my life, she would need to accept and respect my military career and the choices I'd made in service to my country. Her response came back within hours, and it was everything I'd expected: defensive, accusatory, and filled with the same victim narrative that had characterized her reaction to the demonstration. She accused me of being impossible to please and claimed that nothing she did would ever be good enough for my new superior attitude. Reading her response, I realized that Sophia was incapable of the kind of self-reflection and personal growth that would be necessary for us to have a healthy adult relationship. She was too invested in her own narrative about being the successful sister to acknowledge the ways she'd diminished and dismissed my achievements over the years. I made the decision not to respond to her second email. Instead, I chose to focus my emotional energy on the family relationships that showed potential for growth and healing, while maintaining polite but distant contact with Sophia during family gatherings and holidays. The changes in family dynamic became most apparent during our next major gathering, Thanksgiving dinner 3 months after the barbecue demonstration. The seating arrangements, conversation topics, and general family interactions all shifted in subtle but significant ways that reflected everyone's new understanding of my actual status and achievements. For the first time in decades, I wasn't seated at the far end of the table or treated like the family member who needed to be included out of obligation rather than genuine interest. My parents asked detailed questions about my work, my travel, and my professional responsibilities with the kind of engaged curiosity they'd always shown for Sophia's career developments. More importantly, they listened to my answers with genuine attention and asked follow-up questions that demonstrated real interest in understanding my life and experiences. It was a dramatic change from the previous pattern where mentions of my military service had been met with polite disinterest and rapid subject changes. Sophia, meanwhile, seemed uncomfortable and off-balance throughout the gathering. She made several attempts to dominate conversations and redirect attention to her own achievements, but these efforts felt forced and desperate in ways they never had before. The family dynamics had shifted, and she was struggling to adapt to a situation where she was no longer automatically positioned as the center of attention and primary source of family pride. The most telling moment came when my uncle asked about my recent travel, clearly fishing for information about deployments or operations without directly asking about classified material. I gave him a carefully edited version of a recent training exercise with Allied Special Forces in Eastern Europe, describing the cultural challenges and international cooperation aspects that I could discuss without revealing operational details.
The conversation that followed was engaged and respectful, with multiple family members asking thoughtful questions about international military cooperation, cultural differences in military training, and the strategic importance of maintaining relationships with allied nations. It was the kind of substantive discussion about my professional life that I'd never experienced with my family before. Sophia sat through this conversation with obvious discomfort, occasionally trying to interject comments about her own international business travel or cross-cultural marketing challenges. But her attempts to draw parallels between her corporate experiences and my military service felt hollow and forced, highlighting the vast difference in scale and significance between our respective professional responsibilities. The evening ended with my father pulling me aside for a private conversation that represented the most honest discussion we'd ever had about my military career and his evolving understanding of what I'd accomplished. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble, "not just for not understanding your military service, but for actively dismissing it. I let my own biases about military careers prevent me from seeing what you were actually achieving." The admission was more than I'd expected, and more than I thought he was capable of making.
For a man who had built his identity around professional success and corporate achievement, acknowledging that he'd been wrong about something so fundamental required genuine humility and personal growth. "I've been reading about special operations and the kind of responsibilities involved in commanding joint task forces," he continued. "I'm beginning to understand that what you do requires skills and knowledge that go far beyond anything I've encountered in my civilian career." We talked for nearly an hour about leadership under extreme pressure, strategic decision-making with life and death consequences, and the kind of personnel management challenges that arise when commanding highly skilled individuals in dangerous and dynamic environments. It was the first time he'd ever asked detailed questions about my military responsibilities without immediately comparing them to civilian equivalents or suggesting ways I could transition to more traditional career paths. The conversation concluded with him expressing genuine pride in my service and apologizing for the years when he'd failed to recognize or support my achievements. It wasn't a complete healing of our relationship, but it was a foundation for building something more honest and respectful going forward. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the changes that had occurred in the months since the demonstration. The revelation of my true military status had forced my family to confront their own biases and assumptions about success, achievement, and the value of military service. Some of them had risen to that challenge and were working to build more honest and respectful relationships with me. Others, like Sophia, remained trapped in their own narratives and seemed unable or unwilling to acknowledge the ways their previous attitudes had been harmful and dismissive. The professional side of my life continued to evolve as well. Word of my family's situation had spread through the special operations community, not as gossip, but as a cautionary tale about the importance of family support for military personnel dealing with the unique stresses of classified service. Several colleagues reached out to share their own stories about managing family relationships while maintaining operational security, and I found myself becoming an informal mentor for younger operators who were struggling with similar challenges. The experience of finally revealing my true status to my family had given me insights into the psychological costs of maintaining separate identities that proved valuable for helping others navigate those same challenges. My military career also benefited from the removal of the emotional burden I'd been carrying for years. The constant stress of managing my family's dismissive attitude while maintaining my professional responsibilities had been more draining than I'd realized. With that burden lifted, I found myself more focused and effective in my operational role, able to devote full attention to mission requirements without the distraction of family disapproval and misunderstanding. 6 months after the demonstration, I received notification of my selection for promotion to full colonel, along with assignment to a new position that would involve greater strategic responsibilities and higher-level interagency coordination. It was a significant advancement that represented the culmination of years of proven performance and demonstrated leadership ability. For the first time in my military career, I called my parents immediately to share the news. Their response was everything I'd hoped for, but never expected. Genuine excitement, obvious pride, and detailed questions about what the promotion meant in terms of increased responsibilities and recognition of my achievements.
My father, who had spent years suggesting that I needed to think about real career advancement, was now bragging to his friends about his daughter, the colonel, who commanded special operations forces and briefed senior Pentagon officials on strategic initiatives. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I chose to focus on his genuine pride rather than the years when that pride had been absent. My mother's response was more emotional, but equally validating. She cried when I told her about the promotion, expressing regret for all the achievements she'd missed or minimized over the years, and promising to be more engaged and supportive going forward. Sophia's reaction, conveyed through our parents, was characteristically self-centered. According to our mother, she'd responded to news of my promotion by complaining that Maya always has to one-up everyone else and suggesting that military promotions weren't real achievements like civilian career advancement. Her response confirmed my decision to maintain minimal contact with her while focusing my emotional energy on family relationships that were capable of growth and positive change. Some people are willing to challenge their assumptions and grow as human beings when confronted with evidence that their worldview is flawed. Others, like Sophia, prefer to double down on their existing beliefs rather than admit they might have been wrong about something important. The final validation came during a joint training exercise with International Special Forces units 8 months after the family demonstration. I was commanding a complex operation involving American, British, Canadian, and Australian Special Operations personnel when I received an unexpected visitor. Admiral Richardson, the commander of Special Operations Command, had flown in to observe the exercise and assess the effectiveness of our international cooperation protocols. He spent 2 days watching our operations, participating in briefings, and evaluating the integration of different national units under unified command. On his final day, he pulled me aside for private conversation that would have been unimaginable to the family members who had spent years dismissing my military service.